The United States is trying to block Chinese semiconductors by any means, but Apple has taken a stand against this. There have been continuous reports that Apple is trying to use China's Changxin memory. As a result, Apple is facing a lot of criticism even within the United States. Recently, it was reported that Apple is testing Changxin memory chips in various product lines, including the iPhone and MacBook. In fact, it's not just about testing. It's also reported that Apple has entered into an initial supply agreement to receive general-purpose memory from Changxin memory. Apple is reportedly exploiting regulatory loopholes by negotiating to buy general-purpose semiconductors from Changxin memory instead of ordering custom ones. It seems that Apple has determined that using general-purpose memory chips or negotiating prices does not violate US regulations. However, as Apple continues to push for the use of Changxin memory's chips, there has been considerable criticism within the United States. This is because Changxin memory is included on the blacklist designated by the US Department of Defense as a company linked to the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Being on this list doesn't mean that all transactions are immediately and automatically illegal, but it clearly indicates that the US government is closely monitoring the company from a national security perspective. US political circles are especially wary of Chinese semiconductor firms joining American supply chains. Multiple cases have revealed products with backdoors, leading to widespread awareness that information is being stolen this way. Since Changxin memory is seen by the US as one of the companies linked to China's military capabilities and advanced technological development, concerns about Apple's actions are increasing. For Apple, it's a matter of considering the use of general-purpose memory in products sold in China. But in US political circles, this is seen not just as a simple parts procurement issue, but as a problem of increasing dependence of American companies on the Chinese semiconductor industry. In fact, it is known that Apple is seeking approval from the US government and related agencies to proceed with transactions with Changxin memory. The fact that Apple is working to persuade major institutions and political circles in the US during this process is also fueling controversy, especially since the US has strongly regulated Chinese tech companies like Huawei by linking them to national security issues. Apple's move to expand transactions with a Chinese semiconductor company that is already on the US government's watch list is unlikely to be accepted positively by the political circles. Among US lawmakers, there are concerns that if Apple starts using Chinese-made semiconductors, it could give other American companies a justification to choose Chinese parts as well. The fact that Apple is a company with huge market influence is also making the issue bigger. If Apple accepts Changxin memory into its supply chain, it won't just end with one company's purchasing decision. It could also influence the decisions of global parts suppliers and other IT companies. That's why the US political circles are focusing on the possibility that Apple's choice could conflict with America's semiconductor policy toward China. So why is Apple pushing ahead with negotiations with Changxin memory so aggressively? The biggest reason is likely the memory supply shortage caused by the spread of AI. Currently, in the global semiconductor market, competition among companies trying to build AI data centers is ongoing, and as a result, the demand for memory is increasing significantly. As production of high-performance memory and HBM for AI servers expands, semiconductor companies are concentrating production in this area. Even supply of general memory for smartphones and PCs is getting tight. Demand is rising quickly, but with new production facilities hard to expand immediately, memory prices are going up. For companies like Apple that need huge amounts of memory, this quickly becomes a major burden. Since Apple is not a company that produces memory itself, in order to secure the necessary supply stably, it must either adjust contract terms with existing suppliers or find new sources of supply. Here, Changxin memory has emerged as one of the options. However, there are different interpretations as to whether Apple really intends to make Changxin memory a core supplier. Rather than actually using Changxin memory's products in large quantities, Apple may be using the fact that it has secured a new supplier as leverage to gain an advantage in price negotiations with Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, and Micron. With few memory suppliers, Apple has limited alternatives, even if it demands specific prices or contract terms. If Changxin memory appears to be a real supply chain option, Apple may gain more leverage in negotiations with current suppliers. However, at this point, things are not going according to Apple's calculations. Changxin memory has rejected Apple's prices and demands. In fact, for Changxin memory, there is already demand from major Chinese companies like Tencent and ByteDance. And as demand from overseas PC companies increases, Changxin memory has less reason to offer Apple a lower price. Apple tried to secure a new supplier to increase its bargaining power with existing companies. But since Changxin memory did not lower its prices, the limitations of this strategy have become apparent. Currently, it's no exaggeration to say that Apple is in a crisis. It is reported that Apple has reduced its hardware shipment targets this year due to the impact of the DRAM supply shortage. Similarly, as the memory semiconductor supply shortage worsens, there is a lack of memory chips. There are even rumors that the shipment targets for the iPhone 18 Pro series and Apple's first foldable smartphone, the iPhone Ultra, may be reduced. Changxin Memory is not lowering its prices, but since Apple doesn't produce memory chips directly, there is a shortage. As a result, Apple is in a difficult situation. On top of this, the US government has started to put direct pressure on Apple. It is reported that 6 US senators have sent a letter to Apple demanding a promise not to use semiconductors from China's Changxin Memory and Yangtze Memory. What is especially noteworthy is that they didn't just express concern, but also set a specific deadline, asking Apple to clarify its position by August 21. This shows how seriously the US government views the issue of Apple adopting Chinese-made semiconductors. Apple is now in a very difficult situation. If Apple meets the US government's demands, its plans to use Changxin Memory as a new supplier will inevitably face setbacks. On the other hand, if Apple continues discussions while keeping the possibility of using Chinese-made memory open, conflicts with the US Congress could intensify. In particular, this issue is not just a corporate decision about which components Apple will use in its products, but is directly connected to the US government's technology policy toward China. More importantly, both Changxin Memory and Yangtze Memory were mentioned together. US policymakers are signaling that leading Chinese memory chip firms should be kept out of American companies' supply chains. If Apple agrees to this demand, other American companies may also be heavily influenced when considering Chinese-made memory in the future. On the other hand, if Apple does not comply with the policymakers' demands and continues to push for the adoption of Chinese semiconductors, it is also possible that the US Congress may consider additional regulations or legislative measures. Now, Apple has to make a choice, whether to accept the demands of US policymakers and halt the adoption of Chinese semiconductors, or to continue negotiations with Changxin Memory for supply chain stability. With the August 21 deadline set, the controversy's direction could shift significantly based on Apple's stance. In fact, some say that the situation Apple is facing now is the result of its past supply chain strategies coming back to haunt them. For a long time, Apple has exercised strong purchasing power in negotiations with parts suppliers. Not only did they pressure suppliers to lower parts prices by placing large orders, but they also continuously demanded specific specifications and production schedules for the parts used in Apple products. For Apple, this was a strategy to maintain high profitability, but for their partners, it sometimes led to a huge investment burden. In industries like semiconductors, where new facilities need huge investments of time and money, major client demands strongly influence a company's investment choices. It has become a well-known story that several companies went bankrupt or were on the verge of bankruptcy after expanding their production facilities and investing in equipment to meet Apple's demand, only for Apple to later cancel additional extension contracts. But now, the memory market situation is changing. In the past, Apple was in a position to decide which of the various parts suppliers to contract with, but now, memory suppliers are in a situation where they have to decide where to prioritize the allocation of their production volume. AI data centers have rapidly increased demand for server memory, giving memory companies more reason to prioritize production for high-demand customers. Despite Apple's vast purchasing power, it's now less certain it can get the needed volume at the right time and price. This process is bringing renewed attention to complaints from semiconductor companies that have worked with Apple before. Some companies have criticized Apple in the past for aggressively lowering component prices. For example, recently, Micron, a memory semiconductor company, said that for over 10 years, Apple bought our chips for $5, put them in a metal box, and sold them to consumers as a $99 upgrade. When we tried to raise the price to $7, they either refused or laughed at us. But now that we're charging $5.00, Apple raised the consumer price to $250, criticizing Apple for this behavior. The important point here is whether Apple can continue to pressure suppliers in the same way as before. In the current memory market, suppliers can allocate limited quantities to multiple customers, and demand related to AI continues to increase, so there is no reason for companies to accept Apple's demands for lower prices. In fact, there have been reports that Apple's price and demands were not accepted even in negotiations with Changxin Memory.